My father used to tell me there are only two people in the world, those who are Italian or those who want to be Italian. But I think I'm going to have to revise that tonight. Those who are Irish and those who want to be Irish. At any rate, my name is Jerry Carboni. I'm the library director, and I see a lot of new faces out in the audience tonight, so that's very, very nice. This is a event sponsored by the Vermont Humanities Council. It is in 9 libraries across the state, and we feature a humanities talk on the first Wednesday of every month from October through May. So we're winding down here. This is the March one, and we'll have 2 more. Please, so if you are new tonight, please sign the Humanities Council email list over on the red table, and please, if you would, just take a feedback form and give us your feedback, because we use that to plan for the next year's talks. We have a number of sponsors, or funders, I should say, that help support this lecture series. There are, for Brattleboro, the Brattleboro Savings and Loan, Downs Racklin Martin, and the Wyndham World Affairs Council. And the statewide sponsor is the Vermont Department of Libraries. The main funder, however, for this series and many things that the library does is the Friends of Brooks Memorial Library. And they do that through book sales, which there are 3 per year. So that brings me to tonight's speaker. In December 2009, Jane Carroll spoke here on the subject of projecting leadership, arts used for political ends. Tonight, Dr. Carroll will help us understand the artist's thoughts about theology and the power of the word behind this 1,200-year-old gospel manuscript called the Book of Kells. And we'll get to see these lavish illustrations tonight if our 21st century technology works, and it looks like it's going to. So, Dr. Carroll earned her BA from Smith College and her PhD from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, before becoming a senior lecturer in Dartmouth's Art History Department, where she teaches courses in Gothic, medieval, and Northern Renaissance art. Carroll is the editor of Saints, Sinners, and Sisters, Gender and Northern Art in Medieval and Early Modern Europe, and the author of several articles on Dominican nuns and late medieval art. She also serves as the Assistant Dean of the faculty. So please welcome Dr. Jane Carroll.
I usually ask and really require participation from the crowd. I will probably ask questions along the way, but I want you to as well. And I know not everybody will be able to hear, so I will repeat those questions so everyone can hear it. And if I forget to, remind me. Because what I want to do tonight is to get you thinking about what this book is about and get you involved in trying to understand it. It's a book we all know, and one that is, I think, probably more in our minds than we realize, because it's been used so often for commercialized reasons. And so I thought I'd start with that. I'd start with the Book of Kells mugs, the set of 4 that you can have. You can also find it in the bookshop, actually, of Trinity College in Dublin, where it is housed. They have a series of prints that you can get with different saints. Jewelry seems to be a popular, the ever-present scarf, and I personally have a tea towel. So it is present in so many ways, and part of it is because it is a highly decorative object. And when you have a piece of art that is in itself beautiful in design, it tends to get picked up and used again and again. We see that so often. The beautiful line is something that is easily transported to another medium. I'm just curious to know, what do you folks know about the Book of Kells? Do you know when it was created?
I might be wrong, but when Rome was being invaded, I believe a lot of the scripture went to Ireland.
You must have read Thomas Cahill's book, How the Irish Saved Civilization. And in part it's true. What she was saying was that as Rome falls, so many books get taken to the far ends of empire, one of which is Ireland. This is not, the Book of Kells is actually after that, but it's based upon books that came exactly out of that. What we have is about 800, we think, is when it was done. give or take 10, 20 years. We're not, at that distance, we're not that specific. But what we do know is that it was done as an act of piety. And you have to see it in that spirit, I think, to understand it. The other thing, it's a book of Gospels. So what's the Gospel? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the first 4 books of the New Testament. Why are those the Gospel?
Primary source.
Primary source for what?
The prophets.
Not so much the prophets. Prophets are Old Testament. For Jesus' life, absolutely. So the only part, that big book we call the Bible, how many books are in it? 4. 4 of them are the only ones that tell us the life of Christ. And that's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the first 4 books of the New Testament. After that, you get to the Acts of the Apostles, and then you get all those interminable letters that Paul wrote to everybody telling them how to be good. And it's nothing. It's a very different book from that point on. So the Gospels are the important part. Now, clearly, you understand why. They're going to tell people about Christ's life. There is a kind of misconception, and that says that the Book of Kells was actually used to convert people. And by 800, Ireland's pretty well converted. They jump on the bandwagon and have never gotten off. And so what you have really is a book that is there almost as a paean, as a prayer, as a thank you, if you want to think of it that way, to God and to what he has given us. It is a celebration of faith at that point. We don't know exactly how it was used. I'll be real honest. You're going to find lots and lots of different scholars who will give you different reasons. How could you use a book like this? To teach? Absolutely. You can use it because the images will be nest in people's minds. People tend to remember visuals a lot more sometimes than they even remember the word. They stick in your mind some way. Okay, so to teach, we can use it. What else?
I use it to learn how God wants me to live.
Okay, so we have somebody who says, you read it, and you learn how God wants you to live. Absolutely. And it's not so much just how he wants you to live, but what they wanted to know, because this is mostly monks who are using it, they wanted to know how they should conduct themselves. What were the things, the parameters of faith? And they're really establishing that at this point. We'll get into why that is in a second. So you can use it to teach, you can use it to learn. The other question was whether they used it liturgically. Now, when I say liturgically, I mean during the Mass. Would it be on the altar? Would people actually read it? And I'll let you look at this and look at the writing and see what you think about that. It's not easy to read. We got to tell you this right away. It's not meant to be easy to read. And there's questions about that. And the other way is for meditation. This is in a monastery. The monastery is filled with monks, and it is what I always tell my students: try to understand how few images this civilization had. You know, we pick up the newspaper every day, and we've got images. We turn on the TV, we open up our laptops, we see images. We look at magazines. All of that, we're bombarded with images. But they lived in a very image-poor time, limited amount of visuals to work with. So when you're going to have a visual, when you have an image, you want it to be really rich. You want to be able to dig into it. You want to see things again and again. Things you didn't see the first time, you want to see the second time or third time. So when we're going to look at these, we're going to see how images sort of nest within images, within words or images, everything. Yep?
Well, plus back then, most of the population was illiterate.
Yes, she was saying that most of the population at this time is illiterate, which is absolutely true. Monks are the learned population. We do have, and this is just an aside, we do have a new way in which we figure out illiteracy and illiteracy rates in countries or times. This comes from a scholar who had this brilliant idea. And he said, it's not so much whether you can read, but it's whether you have access to somebody who can read to you. Because it's the communication of ideas rather than the reading of them that becomes the important part of literacy. And so we've sort of ratcheted up our figures since then, but even with that, You still have a fairly illiterate society in Ireland at that time. But one eager to learn. The Irish were actually more literate than many places on the continent at this time. They weren't great, but they were better. And they'll tell you that to this day. So what you have then is a book that is going to be based on creating images that are going to capture the imagination of very learned men, of the monks who live in a monastery. They're going to be looking at it again and again, either on the altar, which is one option, or perhaps passing it around during what they called the chapters, where they got together and they would read a chapter out of the Bible each day. When they did this, they wanted to be able to have something to take away, to think and ponder on, some little piece or big piece. This is actually what we call an opening, and I thought I'd tell you a little bit about manuscripts. Has anyone, who's ever handled or touched a manuscript? An old manuscript? A couple. You be proud. Raise them high. Yes. Absolutely. These are special objects where you can actually feel the presence of someone when you hold it. Someone from long ago. I was saying beforehand, I have a friend who does a talk. She teaches over in Scotland called Dirty Books. And she says that the dirt, she's absolutely right, the dirt that's on manuscripts tells you how they were used. And so, for example, you can see the dirt that's gathered here in this corner. You know that they were picking up the book at the top, turning the page, and then holding it down with their thumb at the corner so they could look at this image. You can see use with the dirt on the manuscript. And we can see in the Book of Kells, it's had a rough life, but despite that, we can also see the dirt of use. Now, in terms of where the tradition comes for this kind of decoration, I wanted to show you just a few things from a period about 100 years before the Book of Kells was created. These are pieces that are come from what we call the migration period, when the peoples who inhabited what we now call England, Ireland, and Scotland were on the move all the time. So what they make for themselves are small objects, things they can tuck in their back pocket or they can put in their knapsack and take with them when they go. They're not making big, important objects, but they're making small, delicate, really refined objects. This is the shoulder. These are two shoulder clasps, and they work like this, that you would sew onto these little these hooks, whatever your cloth was, your cape or whatever. And then you fit. You can see how there's a channel here. There's another one over here. You fit those together. They would interlock like the teeth in a cog in a wheel. And then this pole would go down the center and hold them in place. And your cape would stay on your shoulders. And that's why it's curved, so it's on your shoulders. What I wanted you to see from this is from Sutton Hoo, it's in the British Museum, is that this kind of decoration that we're going to see in the Book of Kells is already present. That's what they're using. They have this interlace pattern that we call it. And if you can look very closely, you can see heads. Here's a mouth. It seems like a snake who's turned around and is biting his own body. Has an eyeball right here. And you'll see that all along here, all along the edges. That sense of the form that snakes in and on itself makes knots and little designs. That's something that they loved. The other thing is that there is an image of power here at the edges. Can you see what this is, what that form is? Let me give you a detail of it. Who knows what that is? There's two of them.
No, swans.
Not swans. No, that's good though. You're in the right category. Animal.
Yeah.
No, not horses, but that's rams. Rams is closest. It's pigs. It's boars. See, here's the ear. Here's the eyeball. Here's the snout. Right here. And then it crosses over like that. And there's his little curly tail and his haunch. And the same thing here. We have another one. Here's his eye, his snout. It arches over, and there's his curly tail. You can see. Once you've seen them, they pop out. But part of that is that intricacy, is that idea of taking nature, something powerful like a boar, and using it as a design. Because these are people tied to nature. You tame that figure, you use it, you make it your own, and suddenly you gain power as well. And Christians are going to take that tradition, they're going to borrow it, they're going to put it in the manuscripts for the decorations, so that that power gets transferred to the Christian faith as well, and gets taken over. And I'll show you one other example. I love these. I think these are so beautiful. First of all, I mean, people call this always the Dark Ages, and I think, yeah, right. Look at that. This is I'm going to put this down. They're about so big, so it's like, I'm trying to think what's about that size that we have. It's a bagel. It's a bagel. And so they're about that size. And what they've done is incredibly detailed work of filigree and filling in with glass, patterning down below, you can see, and then making these little dots of gold and individually affixing them to the background so you get that kind of pattern. This takes, I always make my students do this, what does it take to make this? Patience. Absolutely. Time. Yep.
What fascinates me about that is that the tool that you use to do that is a hammer.
You need to have incredible dexterous control with these things like hammers, big tools.
But these days we have all kinds of wonderful things, but that's done with a hammer.
That's with the most awkward thing you could possibly think of to try to do. And you have to think about it sort of technically. They have to make glass. They have to cut glass. They have to melt and refine ore. They have to be able to create molds. They have to be able to file. They have to use, as a goldsmith would, a kind of anvil. These are all things that have to be done to create this. And I want to dispel the Dark Ages myth that this requires a huge effort of organization and thought that gets poured into these. And part of the same collection was this belt buckle, which is like, it puts rodeo cowboys to shame. It is just amazing. It is big. It's real big. And it would have worked like this. It is two pieces. They're very much the same. Leather would have been attached down here. And these bosses here actually work to hold the two pieces together, and it's hollow inside. And then the leather would go around you and then would loop through this tongue. So it would sort of hang on you sideways, and it's big. It takes over the whole space. We think that in the hollow space inside, a relic was placed, some sort of powerful symbol that gave power to the person who was wearing it. This is a chief or somebody who rules the land. And he's wearing this, and he's using this same snaking motif. You see the eyes here? You'll see the eyes. All through here, and here's a beak of a bird. You see another one down here. All of these are powerful symbols of nature, tamed and used and transferred to the man who wears them. And now we're going to see them transferred to Christ, who becomes the powerful symbol. And that gets used for him as well. And the last thing is, as they began to organize a bit more these Christian images, and you may have seen these what we call the great crosses, the Irish crosses, these too become a sort of symbol of taking over that pagan or migration art and making it into a Christian image. So we have this wonderful sort of disk of the sun. We have on top a relic to mark this as a holy place. Because these mostly were used outside to mark the boundaries of monasteries. In recent times, people have made them into graveyards, but they were never grave markers back in the 7th and 8th centuries, 9th centuries. Those all are 19th century romantics springing up of burial spots. They were meant to mark the edge of a boundary of a monastery. People would gather beneath them. The monks would preach to people who were very illiterate, and the stories would be played out. Moses striking the rock, the adoration of the Magi, Christ in the Last Judgment, the crucifixion. You can go through them. They're there to illustrate and teach with. And those kinds of simplified storytelling is what we're going to see carried over to Kells. So, where is Kells? Kells, I got to find it. Here's Dublin. Kells is right here. Tiny little place. And how it got there. There used to be a belief that said that the Book of Kells was created by the great Saint Columba, or Columcilla. Have you ever heard his name before? Yep. Oh, this is a good group. This is good. I should have brought green beer for you. That would have been much better. Columcilla is the great saint Patrick we all know about, but Columcilla's the guy who did the tough work. You know, Patrick dealt with snakes. Columcilla dealt with souls. He was out there converting right and left. And he ends up founding a colony of holy men on an island in what is now the Hebrides off the coast of Scotland, in Iona. It was fabulous for producing manuscripts. Many of the 75 Hiberno-Saxon manuscripts to which the Kells belongs as a family came from Iona. So they knew what they were doing. They were working on it. He dies 597. And the tradition carries on. And he is the great father of Irish monasticism. About 800, 770 on, there is a huge disruption that happens through Great Britain and what we now today would call Ireland. Do you know what that was?
Vikings.
Vikings, yes. The Vikings start swooping in, and Columcilla's original monastery on Iona is incredibly vulnerable because it's on an island, and the Vikings love to sort of pick it off. So what the monks decide is that, unfortunately, they need to split up. They split up the relics, they split up the books, and some of them go over to a more secluded spot in Scotland, and another group come over here, and they found Kells. Where I lost it again, I gotta go up, here it is. They found Kells, and we think they bring this manuscript with them. Because this manuscript is unfinished, and we think that in the breakup of the monastery, it remained unfinished. It is 340 folios, and it's now housed in Trinity College. It stayed in Kells. In the 12th century, the monastery was dissolved, and the church became a parish church, and the Book of Kells stayed in the parish church. And then the 17th century, what happens? England, yes. Cromwell was we always say when we go to Ireland, just like, you see a ruin, you go, oh, Cromwell was here. Cromwell comes, and he is just decimating the land. So that they knew they had a relic, they knew they had something special, so they take the Book of Kells to Dublin for safekeeping. It's 1657, something like that. 1661, then the fellow who was keeping it safe gives it to Trinity College, and that's where it is today. It's been on display, and this is the library at Trinity. This is Trinity. This is the lines you have to wait in to see the Book of Kells. I just wanted to prepare you before you go over. It takes a while. Go when it's raining, but when isn't it in Ireland? So, it's a beautiful, absolutely beautiful library, and there's lots of great treasures in it. But everybody makes a beeline for the Book of Kells, as they should. It has been, as I say, 340 folios, and we'll get into what a folio is in just a second. It has been rebound at least 5 times. In the 18th century, when they rebound it, they cut it really drastically to try to make all the sides even. And you'll notice when we look at some pages that it's going to be a little nipped in. It seems a little crowded, and that's from that cutting. And when they rebound it in 1953, I think, they rebound it in 4 books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So that today when you go, you'll see 2 images. They take 2 each time and open them up so you see 2 openings when you go to visit. Who's been there to see it? Yeah, it's gorgeous. So it's a wonderful sort of pilgrimage that you make. A little bit about how you make a book of, because I want you to understand the skill that goes into this. Has anyone ever made a manuscript? There you go. I will tell you just that it is a time-consuming, multi-personed effort to do this back in the Middle Ages. What did you write on? Parchment. And parchment comes from? Skin. Sheep, goat, calf. This happens to be calf skin. And this is a big book. What you have is you have a big skin, and so you're going to cut it out. Here's the guy who is the tanner, and he's stretching a skin back here on a frame, you see. He's got another one rolled up, and he's selling to the monk a nice piece of tanned parchment, or vellum, whatever you want to call it. And that piece has been cut out from that irregular shape that's being stretched to make a nice even size, what we call a folio size. And normally what you're going to do is you're going to take and you're going to fold it in half. And you open it up, and you have a bifolio. fun stuff. Every folio has a recto and a verso. So when I say there's 340 folios, that means there's 680 pages, just so you can get in your head. We've lost some. We've lost some along the way for different reasons. In about 1007, the Book of Kells was stolen out of the Church of Kells. And we have actually, I even wrote it down for us, a reference from the Annals of Ulster, which is the first historical accounting of what has happened in Ireland. And they wrote, "The great Gospel of Columcille, the chief relic of the Western world, was wickedly stolen during the night from the western sacristy of the great stone church at St. Annis," which is Kells, "on account of its wrought shrine, its golden cover. The manuscript was recovered a few months later, minus its golden and bejeweled cover, under a sod," meaning it was buried in the earth. So it had a rough life, shall we say. And we lost some pages then. We think maybe up to 20 pages were lost in that ripping out. We don't have some of the images we expected to have. Sometimes in the middle of telling a story, it stops abruptly, and there's in the middle of the gospel is gone. So we know it was not well treated, I guess. And the next time we have it mentioned, and I just wanted to because I think this is so beautiful, is the 12th century. Gerald of Wales is writing this history about what does it mean to be Irish? What is it about? So it's 12th century, and he writes about the Book of Kells. "This book contains the harmony of the four evangelists, according to Jerome, where for almost every page there are different designs, distinguished by varied colors. Here you may see the face of majesty divinely drawn. Here the mystic symbols of the evangelists, each with wings, now 6, now 4, now 2. Here the eagle, there the calf, there the man and the lion, and the other forms almost infinite. Look at them superficially with the ordinary glance, and you would think it was a mirage, not tracery." He means not drawn by man. "Fine craftsmanship is all about you, but you might not notice it. Look more keenly at it. You will penetrate to the very shrine of art. You will make out intricacies so delicate and so subtle, so full of knots and links, with colors so fresh and vivid, that you might say that all this were the work of an angel and not of a man." And I think that really sums up what it meant to people, what they thought of when they looked at this. They knew that there had been a monk out there. They knew that he had to go and buy this. They knew that the paper had to be cut, and then you'll see it had to be ruled so it could be written on, that it had to be illuminated by another person still. We can just see the number of hands that are going on. And it was written, we know, with iron gall ink, which is very hard to make. It takes iron sulfate and mixes it with a wood apple, we sometimes call them, or a wood gall. That bleaches, they let it ferment, and it bleaches it out. And then they take gum arabic to give it sort of consistency. And what makes it so interesting is that gum arabic, to get it, it only comes from the acacia tree, which grows around the Mediterranean and in Arabia. So here on Ireland, they are getting the goods to make their book from as far away as Arabia, Egypt, wherever. That's what's coming into them. They're using lapis lazuli, ground stone, that comes from Afghanistan. Just to let you know, we are not an isolated group of poor people. These people are reaching out and using the best that is available at this time for this book. And this is some iron gall that actually was recovered in a monastery. And to reconstitute it, you just mix it with some water and put it back. And just to show you that this is how, there's usually one person who is a specialist in the monastery at drawing the letters and another a specialist in the coloring of them. So you can get a sense of how that's done. People then, the people who write it can't erase. There's no way you can erase vellum. It sinks right in. So if you make a mistake, you have to take a knife and you have to scrape away the skin till you get back under to the right spot. And you have, and I love this one, you have a monk and a layperson both doing the writing in this little scriptorium. People, this was really hard work, and this is little Hildebert who did a self-portrait of himself at the end of a manuscript he copied. You can see his different colored inks and his pens, and he's got a pen behind his ear, and he's got an apprentice down here, Evervinos, who's copying out these little designs. And on the table, it says Mensa Hildebert, meaning the meal of Hildebert. And here's a mouse who's eating his bread, and he's going to take the sponge and throw it at him to kind of get rid of him. It's not a fun job, and it's not a neat and tidy one. At the end of a manuscript, oftentimes there's what's called a colophon. And the colophon is the one moment where they can say, glory, hallelujah, thank the Lord, I am done writing this book. And they sometimes will give their name, they oftentimes will give the year. And every once in a while, they give a little inscription about who they are and what it was like. And my favorite one I ever saw was one where the fellow wrote, I am done with this book, and he gives the date, and he says, my eyes ache, my back hurts, my fingers are cramped, my toes are cold. 2 fingers right and the entire body suffers. It's not a great time doing this. But it's so important, and the weight of what you've done. What you have done is so important that here we have this monk who is dead, and the devil is being chased away. His soul is taken up to heaven because the book that he wrote is of such importance. It gives him the ability to go to heaven, that the writing of a book is of that kind of weight to this society. So we're back to our Book of Kells, the main... He may have died because he was a scribe. We don't know. But what we have here then is a book that people are going to prize because of the skill that it takes to write it, the skill it takes to copy it, the materials that are used from far away, the time it takes and it represents, the word and what it represents, and the fact that it is the holiest book known. This is piling so much meaning onto one book that we have to understand that this is a book beyond what we have on our shelves most of the time. And beauty. It is. It is just gorgeous. And so now that you sort of know how a book is put together, I wanted to sort of walk you through the Book of Kells. When you start out each of the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, there are 4 images that appear at the front of every one of those chapters. And the most famous ones are a series that we call, and this is 2 different ones, cross-carpet pages. What do they remind you of?
Quilts.
Quilts? Oh, that's good. What else? It's a very Vermont answer. Rugs?
Checkerboard.
Checkerboard? Tapestry, definitely. Yep. Tile, absolutely. Yep, I can see that. Mosaics, definitely. And what kind of rugs? Persian, Turkish, whatever. Not things made in Ireland. We want to say this right away. So again, we have that sense of reaching out to a culture far away and bringing it in. The other thing is that cross-carpet pages almost always embed within their designs the form of the cross. And it can be kind of loosely like a Greek cross here, or it could be the Western cross inside. So they're not really copying a carpet per se, but they are taking the idea of tiles, mosaics, carpets, and creating this. This is unique, basically, to Hiberno-Saxon manuscripts. Now, how do you know it? How do you see the cross? What do you notice about it? I'm going to make you work. We'll just work with the one on the. Maybe I did. Yeah, I did. What do you notice about it? Yep.
The ends are larger.
Absolutely. The ends of these are larger, so that you get this sort of like anchor point at the end. It helps you find it. What else? What else helps you find it?
It's not a solid color.
It's a solid-ish color. They're all kind of, you notice, like some of them are red, some are pink, but they kind of are in a family of colors. It's outlined. So it is outlined, which gives, in the midst of all this color, a kind of blank area so you can find it. But you said something about squares?
Oh, I see a lot of squares.
Yeah, they have these squares that are a different color. Look, it's the only green in the entire composition. There's a kind of pale green here, but the deeper green. So those anchor you in like little nails, nailing that cross on the page. What else?
It's in 6.
It's in 6. What does that mean for you? Oh. I don't have any. I thought maybe I'd learn something new. I don't know what. But yes, it is. It has these 6 sort of points that it kind of punctuates throughout.
It's really centered.
It's centered.
Like
Yeah.
photography shot.
It is centered on the page, so that you know that's the most important. That's where you put your focus is right there.
And the white in the center of those little squares,
Mhm.
looks like a light.
That white in the center of the squares is the only part of that design where there's no line. And when soon as you do that, when you have the absence of something that there's such a superfluity of everywhere else, boom, it captures your attention. It just jumps out at you. Anything else that strikes you guys?
It almost looks like the design of some of the early churches.
Oh, we did. I mean, yeah, the early churches had a cruciform.
Nice.
Absolutely. And the cross is this potent symbol because it is the summation of what Christianity is about. It is about sacrifice. It is about death. It is about salvation. It's what we call the salvific image of all Christianity, because it is about the fact of death so that there could be life, and that becomes the center. If you look at this, you'll also notice that there is a few little spots where like the design stops. See those up there? In every one of the cross-carpet pages, there comes a moment where the design is broken up. It's not completed. It's left a little undrawn, or it's left a little uncolored. A pattern gets established, and then a pattern gets broken. We don't know why. We have suggestions. We think maybe it means it's that nothing can be perfection but that which is God's.
In the Mideast, those elaborate mosaic buildings, they always leave something askew because only God makes things
Perfect. Yes, exactly. She was saying that in the Middle East, and I was just in Istanbul last year, they have these big mosaics, they have these big tiled walls, and they'll leave something that's slightly wrong for that very reason, to say that God only can make perfection. God is the only perfect being among us. So that the idea of that, reminder of an absent perfection is there embedded in the pages as well, each time you look at them. And it becomes a game. I mean, you have to know that once they knew that was there, they must have constantly been looking, where's the little piece that he's left out? What's missing in this one? Sometimes I brought this one because this is the one that's the most obvious. Some of them are incredibly subtle. And you are like tucked away on the edges and that kind of thing, and you sort of know that must have been an aha moment. It's like the Where's Waldo from Monks, You have to keep looking for it. So the other thing I would say about this is that he uses two different colors. There's these strong contrasting colors of yellow, primary colors, and then he uses off colors on the cross so that there's that sense of it jumping out at you in some way. Brighter, lighter, whatever. The problem always for the monks, for Christianity in general, was that the basic tenet of faith, the one they had to grasp, they had to communicate, was the fact that Christ himself is entirely man and entirely God. Two substances in one. There has been some suggestion, so I'm going to bring it for you to chew on, that one of the ways in which the monks tried to communicate that idea were these patterns that seem to go, I was called the push me, pull you, that sometimes one seems to jump out, sometimes another thing seems to jump out, and that idea of two interlocking, equally energetic patterns fighting for attention gives us a sense of the teaching moment that could be used with these images by the monks to talk about that dual nature of God. When you start actually, before you get to the Gospels in Kells, you actually go through the front material. And this is the Kells page, the canon page as it's called. It's a very close in quality manuscript from this period is Lindisfarne, which is in the British Museum, and this is their canon page. A canon page was actually set up by Eusebius, great early father of the church. He soon realized that you've got the same story in 4 books. And he wanted to figure out how can you know who's telling the story and where you can find it. So he set up the canon pages, and each one, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then it tells you the stories that they tell in the right order. And where they overlap is where they are telling the same story. So you can find it. It's this little handy-dandy guide. Usually takes about 12 pages to get a canon page down. That is really shows you they were using the book. Because a canon page is really about using the book. Up above in Kells, You have there's certain themes that show up again and again. Angels, you see here on top. You have these interlaced, like as we've seen, these have to be people, not animals. And we have these sort of griffins and fanciful figures almost protecting the Word of God as they sit up there. And then you start with what's called the brevis causae, which is a brilliant little thing that was done by Eusebius as well. Not this, which we'll get to in a second. But over here, there was the figure. They don't have the Bible broken up into chapters and verses the way we do. So we'll say, Luke 7, verse 36. They didn't have that. So if they had to find something, they had to figure out where it was. So what the brevis causae was it went through each of the 4 Gospels, and it told you the order of the stories. And if it doesn't have the birth of Jesus and John, you knew you didn't go there if that's what you wanted to read about. It was a way to find your way into the book. And so the brevis causae is very important for sort of looking up stuff and knowing where to look. This one in Kells has this image, the first we know of in the Western world, of the Virgin and Child, which starts it out. And then she'll disappear for a while. She doesn't appear really again very much until the 11th century. She says like her one moment. And then on the other side, we start the pages. So I wanted to look at both of these things. We'll come back to her in just a second. I guess we'll do it now. And show you, this is the Virgin and Child from 800. And to show you a traditional sort of Renaissance Virgin and Child. What do you see? What is the difference between what is the traditional way that we tend to think of the Virgin and Child and what's happening in Kells? What are they trying to tell you in the Renaissance about the Virgin and Child? That they're real. They look, there's a tenderness we see. What else?
Holy.
Holy. How do you know they're holy?
Those angels.
Oh, let's not look there. Let's look here right now.
Oh.
Hold that thought, though. We're going to be there. So there's a realness, a tactile quality to them. What else?
Three-dimensional.
Very three-dimensional. They project into a world that we understand. Yep, back. They have a landscape that lets us see them in a world that's theirs. They inhabit that. What about their relationship?
Very intimate, loving, nurturing.
It's intimate, it's loving, it's nurturing, all those terms. And you see the reaction that he nests within her arms and she looks down at him. We get that connection between them. Color helps. The warmth of the red, this is all part of what is kind of letting us know it's a warm and intimate scene. So that's what we expect to see in a Virgin and Child. So look at Kells. What's happening here? What's the concern? What is this artist trying to say about it?
It looks like a man, number one.
It looks like a man.
It's already grown for us.
Oh, he does. Yes, he looks very grown. He's actually much older as a child. He's not a baby.
There's an otherworldliness also.
It's reversed in what way?
Well, the child is on one side, and the picture, the other one is on the other side.
I see. Oh, yeah, that's right. So that the child who tends to be looking out seems to be much more turned towards her.
There's an otherworldliness about it. It's not of this world.
Why do you think it's not? I think you're right. But what makes it seem not of this world?
Well, just there's no humanness. I mean, look at the face of the
Virgin?
mother. I mean, yeah, it's just she's just not there.
No landscape, no setting.
And you've got the angels.
But we're back to your angels, which puts it in a different place. So what you know right away is that what they're interested in, these monks, is not about the human connection of mother and child. They're not interested in that aspect of what a virgin and child should represent. So what are they interested in?
Human and divine.
The human and the divine, I think it's very clear. He is a human form and yet divine because he doesn't look like us. It's different. He's got these angels. What else?
She has a halo.
She does have a halo. She has a quite gorgeous halo. So we know they're divine, which helps us, which is missing in the Renaissance.
They're not of this world.
It doesn't look like a baby. It looks like a grown man.
It looks like Pinocchio.
The baby is not, he's not a baby. He's not cuddly. He's a little man, and as such, we are reminded then that his role is not that to be charming. His role is to sacrifice for us. He's not. We're not allowed to identify him as somebody who we can grab onto and cuddle. We are seeing him as a guy who's going to take on a big task. The difference, and what I want you to understand, is that you change art because you have a different agenda for what you want to get across. And that we tend to say, when everyone says, and I always tell my students, oh, there's a virgin and child in the book of Kells, and they're expecting this. And we get to this, and they just burst out laughing. They're just like, no, I don't believe that. I was like, yeah, this is the real thing. And it's quite regal, because she sits on a throne, and look at the jewels on that throne.
Does she have rings in her nose?
No, she doesn't. Those are just her nostrils. It's just, she doesn't have rings in her nose. My daughter has rings in her nose, but she doesn't. But she's sitting there. She's very matronly. She's definitely part of the scene. She has, for example, women who were not married wore their hair loose and uncovered, but women who were married covered their head, and so you see her as matron, sitting there proper in the distance on this jeweled throne. This angel with the staff behind her looks like a courtier, waiting on her. She is queen of heaven as she's sitting there. He is the king come to save us. There are all these sort of layers of theology that are present in this scene that make it about thinking about what this is going to have to happen, as opposed to having a sympathetic, almost empathetic relationship that we have later in art with the Virgin and Child.
She's not looking at the baby. She looks like she just swallowed the lemon.
She does look a tad grumpy. All my students always find that she's like a little grumpy, but she's got the weight of the world on her. She's got a child who's going to die. It's a bad thing. Yeah.
I'm very curious about this depiction in Kells is 800.
Yeah, exactly.
How much different is this than what had been in the previous couple of 100 years, couple of 500 years, whatever?
You mean in what way?
In whatever sort of art or illuminated manuscripts or whatever they had for presenting religious iconography?
It's a good question. He's asking how different is this style of Kells from the tradition that was existing before it. And I would say it is extremely different. And there's really a reason that I can give you for that. And what that is that Kells represents the anti-classical tradition. That traditionally what you see in Italy is that they still have the remnants of the Roman Empire. They still have Roman rolls, not codexes, but rolls that are illustrated that they're looking at. And there is a tradition for that classical way of depicting things, what we call the togate figure. The figure with the toga, and that becomes sort of the natural, generic, this is from an olden time kind of clothing that they like to wear. And the tradition is for the sort of proportioned figure, the realistic face. That tradition is I would say, Roman tradition that gets carried on in different areas. Where the Hiberno-Saxon manuscripts vary is that they don't look to that for their inspiration. They look to that migration art we were looking at with the boars and the snakes and all that. So what they're doing is creating, almost out of whole cloth, their own tradition that's going to become this antithetical tradition to the classical, until eventually it will merge, as inevitably happens when one becomes more stronger than the other. Yep.
If you look at that image and you think of it being symbolic as well,
right?
The female/male, very androgynous-looking virgin could also represent with the child, if you will, who from back here kind of looks like he even has a mustache, could represent the relationship between the
God,
sacred, and the human.
Yet, what she was saying is that this is such an androgynous figure that instead of just being a woman, it almost could be the Godhead or the Spirit, or holding Christ on his lap as well. And that symbolically there is that kind of ability to cross over. I think that it probably does work to a certain degree in the generic sense. I do think she's actually very female compared to all the men. Her head's covered, and right away that makes her a female to the people who are used to reading the language of this kind of image. But I do agree she's just as much a throne as she is a person. And as such, she presents Christ to us. What people are reading as mustache is really his jaw, his little cheek. It's like a cheekbone that's going in. Yep?
That almost looks Byzantine on the left. Was there a crossover between the two?
It's interesting. He says it almost looks Byzantine. Was there a crossover? And I can give you a short answer, which is yes. But what is even better is we actually know to some degree what it was, that we don't have the books. We know that shortly before 800, there was a pilgrim coming from the Holy Land who was supposed to land in the south of England, and instead got blown around and landed in Iona. And that he had with him, according to the annals of Iona, he had with him 14 books that he had brought back from the Holy Land. And 14 doesn't sound like much to us when we look at this room, but 14 was a gold mine. 14 may have been what gave them this more iconic-looking Virgin and Child. It may have been what gave them the idea for the cross-carpet pages. We don't know. The problem is we don't have those 14 books. But we do know there was contact. Now, in the Brevis Causae, in the beginning, and in so many pages with text on it, you see these little figures, these little guides, who sit there and they open a book or hold a book and show it to you. And then they sort of point the way into the text in some fashion. The book, if you see him, here he is, he's right up here. He's our guy. And this is from one of those migration pieces, that not the one I showed you. This, you see the eye and see the open mouth here and the sort of like swan's head or duck's head. And those are very much like what we're seeing up here, just to show the crossover, how it continues.
What's in the corner there? Yeah, what's
this?
That?
Well.
It's kind of big to me, but...
It's got these two little eyeballs. I don't know what that is. I'll be honest. I don't know. It could be just a kind of design. It could be a kind of stylized head. I don't know. But it's up here as decoration in this line. The figure here, some people suggest it's John the Baptist, which could oftentimes be the case. He works beautifully. Last prophet of the Old Testament, although he's in the New Testament, but he's the one who points the way to Christ, and this is going to start telling the story of Christ. It's all about incarnation and salvation, so it's working out. And he shows you this book, and now it's blackened, but once it was silver, and when it was polished, when you looked at it, it would have reflected the light, so the word would have glistened. And I think that must have been pretty spectacular when that happened. And then, just before you start each of the Gospels, you have the cross-carpet page, which I'm showing you here, and then you have a page with the 4 evangelist symbols. Have you seen these before? The winged man, I'm trying to think, the winged, it must be the lion up here, the winged, the eagle, and then the winged bull. Do you know those? No? They come from apocalyptic visions in Revelations, where those 4 winged creatures appear in the sky. And theologians saw them and said, they represent the 4 Gospels. And they made each one of them represent one of the Gospel writers. So that Luke is the bull, Matthew's the man, John's the eagle, and Mark is the lion. There is unity in the message of the 4 Gospels, and that they are inextricably intertwined. They're also, I think, some of the most, they make great jewelry. You'll see lots of jewelry copied after these guys. They're very intricate, very detailed, and the lapis lazuli is very obvious here. That I was telling you comes from Afghanistan, is all over through here. It's a very elaborate page. And then you have what I call the author portrait, and you start the chapter. So Matthew is here, as he stands there holding his book, and then you start the page. And this is why I say it's hard to read, because these are the words. What are the first words? What's the first word of Matthew? Do you remember? Anybody know? See, in the South, they know this immediately. What's the first? It says, it's the book of the generations of Jesus Christ. And then he starts out and he tells you, it's all the begats, you know. Jesus was the son of David, who was the son of Abraham, who was the son, it's all those. So the book in Latin is Liber, right? Liber, Liber. So here's your L, here's your I, here's your B, and ER. I know, isn't it great? It's just beautiful. It takes the word and makes a game out of it. It makes it come alive. It's not about reading, it's about vivifying these words. The words literally shake off the page. So Liber is here, and then Generationes is down here. The book of the generations. And that's, you only get two words on that page. This is not about legibility. Because they would have known what it said anyway. But instead, it's about making you see the word as powerful. And the whole Celtic tradition was to see the book as having a power beyond itself. And I can give you two great examples of that, both from the Book of Durrow. And the one is that when the Book of Durrow was discovered, and it's a simpler version, much simpler version of Kells, from an earlier period. It was discovered in the 19th century. And the people who had it knew that it was an old book. And the tradition had said that it was made by Columcilla, which we don't think it was, but they didn't know that. And so they thought it was from the saint himself. And when the cows in that village would get sick, they would take that book and they'd put it in the trough of water from which the cows drank. I could not make this up. And it was to cure the cows, because the power of the word and the power of the book were of such magnitude that this was going to save them, to contribute in some way to transform that water into powerful medicine.
But Jerry would kill us if we did that today.
We don't recommend it today. And our books are made out of stupid paper. It's not vellum. But if you ever get a vellum book here, the other thing is that the book of Durrow in the back had a colophon. And it said in that colophon, Columcilla wrote this in 12 days. Now, there's no way you can copy a gospel book in 12 days. It just doesn't happen. But the power of that inscription told us that this was a special book. And they took that as a kind of way in which to understand the power that was in that book and why it could do these miracle workings. And the other thing was St. Patrick's book that he carried with him is still today present in a reliquary that's kept in the National Museum in Dublin. And that is actually something that people would go in the Middle Ages and through the 19th century and touch whenever they were sick, because the book was so powerful that the Word of God would cure them. That is what they think about when they think about the book. And this is why they will take the time to do these amazing acrobatics with the words on the page. Because it's not just a word, it is magic that they're creating for you. Something tangible and present, living, I think is really what you have to see it. And here's, just to show you, this is the Kells Liber Generationes. It's easier to read this one in the Lindisfarne, which is the sort of sister manuscript in London, where you see the L-I-B-E-R, and then Generationes, Jesu, I-H-U, Jesu Christi, X-R-I, Christi. So you can sort of see how it's kind of spelling out for you. Maybe. But you don't, yet these things are so alive with and embedded with meaning that it didn't matter if you could read the words, you knew what they were. Just to let you know, not every page is like that. I wanted to bring a regular page so you could see that when they get going on the text, it does get easier to read. But it's still decorated much more than most manuscripts are along the way. And just because this is such a great piece of decoration, I had to show you. This, you can see exactly where it came from the migration art, with all of these sort of wild, half-bestial figures biting and snarfing at each other along the way, all sort of together. And I love this with looks like almost some kind of bird of prey who's there, and in his talons he holds the fish, which is out there, the sort of spotted trout that's out there. And as you go along in the book of Matthew, it comes to the time where it says, and Christ was born. And on the page where it says that, it's called the key row page, because key and row, these symbols, are what they use for Christ's name. This is what they do. They blow it up. And the key row, that idea of Christ, the Word is made flesh. And here is the Word that's actually tactile. It's visual for us. You can see it. That Word becomes living in front of us and is even given a head down here as you look at it. All those places in the Bible where it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, they loved those pieces. Every time you got to Word, they would give it a special kind of fireworks, I guess is what I would say. And here's the Lindisfarne key row page, just so you can see. But what I wanted to show you about this, because this is the name of Christ, and that's why it's so important, is that when you get to the details of it, and we're looking at the place right here, you can see how embedded in it are the angels. See the wings of the angels here? See the wafer here inside, the Eucharistic wafer placed inside? All of those sort of moments that seem to almost spin. They don't stay on the page. They just gyrate all across it. They grab you and pull you in as though you're looking through a kaleidoscope. And then everybody's favorite moment is down here at the bottom of the page, where you see, here's a cat, the mouse on his back, and his steps on the tail of this mouse. And here's a second cat with a mouse on his back, stepping on a tail, and the two mice and the Eucharistic wafer in between. Right down here. Christ's body right there where it says Christ is born, Christ is present in our lives, he's on the earth. Yep?
You use the term migration art. Where did that come from and what does it mean?
Migration art we use as, I use that as art historians, it's how we sort of categorize, we love categories. And migration art was really that time when the tribes were really going from place to place. They didn't have fixed settlements. And so the things that they were creating were small and personal and carried with them at all times. Yep.
Well, what I find really interesting is a lot of these designs are very early Celtic symbols that represented things. You know, they did not read. They communicated often through symbolism. And like the Triskells and the Celtic knot of eternity. And what it seems like they've done is taken it to such a new level of intricacy, like you're actually looking at the infinite by looking at these pictures, because it's so collective in their mind based on generations of visual communication through symbolism.
Absolutely. And what she's saying is that they borrow so many of these symbols that have to do with eternity, not the knots that go on forever, the swirling. The Triskel is the tiny little... These are all images that were borrowed from a pagan past and used for Christ, to talk about Christ's powers and his eternal life and the promise of that. And it becomes part of the whole symbol and the Christian vocabulary of a Celtic people at this point. That's why they're borrowing it, because it has such meaning for them.
Now, one thing I've also read that could, it's just one of those books I read, but that unlike England and Scotland, by the time Christianity came to Ireland, they were more acclimated, so they didn't have to wipe out earlier religions. And there's actually more of a Druidic influence in this art. But I don't know.
I would
I'm
say,
asking you.
Yeah, no, the Druid thing is actually much more popular over in England than it is in Ireland. When they do cut them, I know everybody wants to sort of read back romantically, see that they were Druids in Ireland. But we don't have a lot of actual proof for it.
Okay, that's what I'm asking.
But we do have it a lot more in England. So I'm hesitant to buy into that one. Yeah?
The animal symbols, were they, the monks who were doing the artwork, they were putting playful things into there?
Absolutely. She's asking if the monks themselves who were creating this, were they putting this in playfully, if they had this sort of playful spirit? Absolutely. Why should we think they didn't have a sense of humor? Look at the Irish today. Yes, absolutely. And I don't think it's a stretch to see humor in some of these things, or to a wink at times. And I have to say that this idea of the mice eating the Eucharist, there was a huge debate that went throughout the Middle Ages. And the question was, if a crumb of the transubstantiated bread falls on the ground and is eaten by a mouse, has a mouse eaten the body of Christ? Because it's a problem. And so this went back, I cannot tell you the amount of ink that was spilled over this. And they finally came out and they said, no, because, and this is, I love this answer, because belief has to be a part of it. That it has to be from within you. It has to be the belief. So, there may be some of that here. Christ has become flesh in this word. And then we have this whole question being played out for us.
You're talking about wafers, and I don't think they used wafers. I think they just used bread. They made their bread.
They actually, we have some wafer stamps that they use. Not everybody did, and not every place. But the wafers and the idea of wafers were already present, and they came in from then. Their wafers or their bread may have been stamped, rather than, I don't think it was like our wafers today, which taste like paste. I think, they probably very thin bread, but almost like a cracker kind of thing. And we've got the stamps for it. And the other thing I wanted to show you down here is we've also got this little form of the otter holding a fish in his mouth. And of course, the fish is the traditional symbol of the Christian, coming from the Greek contraction of Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, as ichthos, which is the sign for Christ. And it becomes then, that's why we have, evangelicals put little fish signs on the back of their car, because of that. So I'm going to stop right here. We could go on and on with this because there's just so many beautiful images. It's easy to just keep going. But I would say to you, at some point, if you're ever up at Dartmouth, you should go into the art library, because we own a facsimile of the Book of Kells that's in the real size, and anybody can come in and request. It has to be used in the library, but anybody can go in and request it. They'll get it for you, and you can turn the pages and see the 680 images that are there that I can only show you a small piece of. And you can learn how it progresses throughout, continually adding layers for the meaning of what it meant to be Christian at that time. Thank you. I'll take a few questions if you don't have to go, but...
This is just a clarification.
Yep.
At the time that this Book of Kells was being developed, were they breaking new style with their... Were they breaking a new pathways, style of what they're doing? In other words, was there other things going on in Europe, France, or other places that are similar to this, or are they breaking new ground?
He's asking if this is so unique, or are they breaking new ground with this style, or is it in some way, is it match up with things that are happening in France or in Italy? And the answer is no. The Hiberno-Saxon manuscripts, which are 75 of them, they come from Scotland and Ireland, a little bit of northern England. Though they form a unit, and they're almost inbred in the style that they're creating, deriving from that pagan past. And as I say, the rest of the people have a much more traditional classical work. And even southern England has a classical. And the Irish have a different calendar, and their monks have a different tonsure. They shave the front of their head, not the back of it. And it takes until the Council of Whitby before the southern Rome-dominated group in the south of England and the northern people, who are this Celtic tradition, compromise. And that's when they sort of come together. But until then, they're very different units. Yep?
The Celtic scribes ever slip in some Celtic, or was it all Latin?
It was all Latin. All Latin. And unfortunately, we would love it. We would love to see a little note on the side, but no, they didn't.
When this was begun, the Book of Kells, and there was so much turmoil with Vikings, and is it possible as well that the effort that was put into this was not only sort of a faith-based, sacred, sort of pious thing, but also if you have barbarians coming and you want to protect your faith in a way that would only be transmitted to those who understood what they were seeing, and it was a way of sort of a repository of this knowledge and beauty that could then be for the generations to come. It was a way of, perhaps, I'm just conjecturing here, that it might have been also done for that reason as well.
I mean, it becomes more of a sort of an interior language that would not be understood by the barbarians? Is that what you're saying?
Well, a way to convey this message and this beauty for those who are your people, if you will,
but you
versus
speak
the barbarians who might, you know, if it's not conveyed, if you don't have other books, if people aren't literate, how do you care for and pass along treasures? And that could be visual treasures or, you know, treasures of religion or faith in an environment that's very threatening and hostile.
Mm-hmm. I think there are two things, sort of 2 points there. One is that the Vikings themselves seem to not have had any desire to take and keep any of the things that the books that they took as booty, whatever, when they were raiding. We have, for example, in none of the collections over there in Denmark or Sweden, for example, any of these Hiberno-Saxon manuscripts. They didn't take it, as far as we can tell. Or if they did, they just destroyed them, which was the other option. I think that idea of an internal dialogue is absolutely true. I'm not sure it was done to keep people out, but I think the dialogue is going in among those who believe, which are the monks within this very short, this tight-knit community. Very learned men, you know, they're actually, I didn't even go into this, but the Vulgate Bible, which is the basis for so much of the Gospels that are translated here, is not used 100%. They go back and forth between the Vulgate and an earlier translation of the Bible because they must have liked some of the more poetic passages of the earlier. So they had at least 2 copies that they were working from, and they're making decisions as to what goes in. So they're very learned, and they're trying to figure out how to take that learned ideas and the theology that they're steeped in and give it a visual vocabulary. Yep.
I am fascinated by this lapis lazuli coming from Afghanistan.
Yes.
I mean, do you just order that, you know?
The question was, can you just order your lapis lazuli to come from Afghanistan? And the answer is no, but it was one of the things, the pieces that were prized, and people knew it was prized. There were actual trade routes, and they had a lot to do with what we would now call the journey to the Mediterranean and the Mediterranean round. These people are not isolated. And they know, for example, we know that people would be sent out by Columcilla to go to Rome and talk to the Pope and then come back. So they're going back and forth. They're going to the south of England to talk to those outliers who are following Rome, not the Celtic tradition, and they're bringing things back. So we always had this vision of the Middle Ages that these people had glue on their butts and they never moved, and it really wasn't. They did move. It wasn't easy, but they did do it. And as I said, there were these people traveling to the Holy Land and coming back with booty stuff.
They had the Spanish were trading all along there and bringing wine.
She was saying the Spanish were trading and bringing wine and olive oil.
And olive oil, yeah.
They loved that, yes, absolutely. Yeah?
Can you give me some idea of how long that whole thing took to make in terms of years and months and days? Was it a generation of people?
Not quite, but here's what we think. I can give you a general idea. One of the suggestions has been that the Book of Kells was actually commissioned by the monks to be done to celebrate the 200th anniversary of the death of Columcilla, which would have been 797. And we think about 800, maybe 801, they flee from Iona and they take the book with them. That's about 4 years, 4 or 5 years, and it's not finished at that point. So we can probably say that they would have needed another year, 2 years to finish it all the way in the level of decoration to the end, the way it is in the beginning.
Because I was thinking within the community, I mean, just imagine realizing that you have a piece of work like that coming and thinking, who are the people who can really do the best work? And can't you just imagine how it was to have that come out of that community of people?
Absolutely. And, you know, they had to know. I work on Dominican nuns in the late period, and you see them. They know that somebody has a really firm handwriting. So that person gets in charge of the scriptorium. And then somebody comes in, and then they write in the annals, you know, hallelujah, we've got somebody who can draw figures, and she becomes the illustrator. So people brought their gifts. And I think what was probably the most interesting, the conversation I want to sit in on, is when they're sitting around breaking bread and they're talking about the theology that's going to go in this and how to come up with the symbols for it, because I would love to have been part of that. Yep, I'm sorry, there's somebody in the first row back in.
Yeah.
Just a second, yep.
Could you talk a little bit about the education of the monks? Did they go to different places, or was this an insular arrangement?
She's asking about the education level of the monks and where they did their learning came from. There was a seed group that came up from Rome. But once that gets established, they're teaching themselves again and again. They're going down to Rome, they buy books, they bring them back up. Don't forget, Latin is a language that allows you to communicate across countries. They didn't have the barriers we do today going through. And they are hungry for influences. So like when this fellow who gets blown off course comes with his 14 books, I'm willing to bet they sat down there and he wouldn't let them leave till they copied all 14. You know, it's like, you don't get to go. This is one of those, you took what you could and you used your opportunities, is basically what you did. But they were amazingly literate, and the hand they write in, that fine hand they develop, is so beautiful. They were working hard to do honor to this the Word of God, is what they saw. Mm-hmm, yeah?
Thank you so much. I'm interested to hear how the field of art history in looking at this manuscript has changed over the last couple of centuries, maybe. I mean, just
sit down. I'll give you kind of a Cliff's Notes, if I can. There has always been a kind of appreciation for the Book of Kells. It's just an extraordinary document, so lavishly illustrated. The original, when people started writing about it, and the first time you really see it written about a lot is during the Romantic period, that whole Celtic revival that came about in the 19th century. They talked about it as the expression of sort of primitive man. And that was really wrong. But it was the Romantic vision of the monk out on the moor, and you know, there's nobody around, and he's writing this brilliant thing, and it's divinely inspired by God. As they got more sophisticated by the end of the 19th century, they really began to see it as a treasure of that moment in time, and see it much more as about the learnedness of Ireland at this time. And there is, after the Irish break away, after the Troubles in the 1920s, when Ireland becomes its own country, it becomes really a symbol for the country, as a moment of national pride placed on display, and they begin to write their own histories of their own art history. Those are some of the most fascinating things to read, because it becomes nationalistic in what it's being said. It gets used much, you know, like we would use the flag as a kind of banner, and a kind of way of saying, when the English came in the 17th century and they destroyed our monasteries and took our things, we still remained and had this core that was us, and we still have it. And then in the 20th century, we've gotten a lot more technical. Yeah.
If it came from the Hebrides, why did we say it's Irish?
Well, they didn't know all that back then. They thought it came from Kells, and some people still believe it was created in Thanksgiving after the monks escaped from the Hebrides and came to Kells. And that makes it a little more problematic. There is no clear consensus. Some people think it was done on the Hebrides and taken when they left. I tend to fall in that crowd. I really think it was probably commissioned for that 200th anniversary of Columcilla's death. I think that makes a lot of sense, the way the monks thought. But many people would say it was not done until the Thanksgiving in Kells. Some people think it was completely done maybe in Scotland from by the other group, because they did the Lindisfarne, and then shipped over as a thank you to the people. So everybody's got a theory. But the Irish want it to be Irish, and that's more important than whether it is or not.
Did the monks from Ireland come from Ireland?
The monks, they came from what we would call, they didn't separate it out that way. They came from that span that we would call Ireland, the Hebrides and Scotland, that northern Celtic band. And that Irish Sea was getting
Christianity started in Ireland, not anywhere in England.
Yes, it did. No,
yeah, it did. It did. It got taken over there first. But I have to say the English, although they weren't as receptive, the English had some opportunities early on too, shortly thereafter. They were just much slower to accept it than the Irish were, which I always think is fascinating, and I don't have an answer for why. Okay, I think we're done then. Thank you so much.